So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Timbro. My name is Malin Salén. I'm responsible for economic policy here at Timbro. Today we're talking about Iceland, the financial crisis, and capitalism as we know it. And I know this is going to be a really interesting talk, but I will now leave the floor to Pernilla Ström, who's going to lead the talk today.
Thank you, Malin, and good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this morning seminar where we're going to discuss Iceland, the crisis that hit Iceland so severely a couple of years ago, lessons to be learned, and some other stuff as well. Today we're going to listen to our most distinguished guest. His name is Gissurarson. He is professor of political science at the University of Iceland. He has written many books and articles, and according to Wikipedia, which I checked out, he is also quite a controversial person in the public debate on Iceland, promoting free market policies and classic liberalism. Mr. Gissurarson was also a member of the board of Central Bank of Iceland in the years 2001 to 2009. He has been behind the foundation of the Independence Party that is back in government right now. And he has also published a book I read 10 years ago about how can Iceland become the richest country in the world. And it turned out that Iceland almost became one of the poorest countries during this severe crisis. Professor Hannes Gissurarson, please, the floor is yours. We can give him a hand, ladies and gentlemen.
It is a great pleasure to be here in Sweden and sharing the podium with such a distinguished person as Urban Bäckström. We can learn a lot from the way the Swedes coped with their crisis in the early 90s. It's also interesting to tell you that Swedish economists have been quite influential in Iceland. I wrote the biography of the founder of the Independence Party, engineer Jón Þorláksson, and he actually was a disciple of Gustav Cassel. Most of what he wrote about economics was almost verbatim from Cassel's popular writings. Then in the 1930s, when the first left-wing government was formed in Iceland, they called upon a special advisor from abroad to help them establish a plan economy, as they called it, in Iceland. And that economist was Erik Lundberg. He came to Iceland and made a survey of the Icelandic economy. Then in the 1950s, we had another distinguished economist visiting Iceland, having quite an impact on Iceland, and that was Gunnar Myrdal. He came to Iceland and told the Icelandic farmers that food prices would go up in the world, so they should produce much more. So we introduced many more subsidies in our agriculture than we had before, under the influence of Gunnar Myrdal, and we are still trying to cope with those subsidies and reduce agriculture. So these are the three economists that have been quite influential from Sweden in Iceland.
We're so sorry.
No, not at all. Gustav Cassel was very good, and we learned a lot from him and from Bertil Ohlin. We have always been impressed by the strong tradition of free market economics that Sweden has had. Now, if we turn now to the talk that I am going to give, why Iceland was left out in the cold, I would like to make a few points. We have this in world history that small nations are in a difficult situation. There was a small island called Melos, and there was a superpower in Attica at that time called Athens that everybody knows. And there is a famous dialogue that Thucydides chronicles in his history of the Peloponnese wars, where the Athenians, they demanded that the Melians, they surrendered their independence, paid tribute, or would be destroyed. The Athenians, they were very blunt. They played realpolitik. They played might is power. They said to the Melians, you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And this is something that we have experienced in Iceland. The weak have had to suffer, and I'm going to explain that a little bit in my talk. The Melians actually refused to surrender, and they were destroyed, but irony has it that Athens lost the war, and Melos was restored. So what is it that happened in this small country from which I come in 2008? This is a question I've actually been trying to answer myself, because at the beginning this came as a total surprise to me. I would never pretend that I foresaw the debacle, the collapse at all. So it has taken me about 5 years to try to analyze it and explain it and understand it myself. Now, we see a few things much more clearly than we did then. For example, we see that the Icelandic bank collapse was no worse a crisis than in many other European countries. We didn't think so at that time. We thought it was unique. This was a shock to our country. Peaceful and prosperous out in the North Atlantic, left alone by others. We also see that the Icelandic banking sector was definitely big, and it has grown very rapidly before the collapse, but it was no bigger than in the United Kingdom or in Switzerland, if we measure it that way. Also, and that was what people thought at the time in 2008 when the collapse took place, that the Icelandic bankers were almost criminal, at least very reckless. But we see when we discuss other bankers elsewhere that they were just as reckless. So I don't think that is really an explanation for the collapse of the banking sector. Then we worked under the same regulatory and legal framework as the other European countries, because we were members of the EEA, the European Economic Area, so we had precisely the same legal framework. What I think really happened in Iceland is that we had a vulnerable situation. We had systemic risks that didn't exist elsewhere, but into this vulnerable situation came decisions from abroad that made the system collapse. And that's what I'm going to explain a little bit in my talk here. Now, if we just briefly speak about the causes of the international crisis, my mentor, my intellectual mentor, Milton Friedman, he once wrote a very famous article called "Why Capitalism is Depression-Proof." But I don't think he is actually right. I think that we are subject to business cycles, to regular bubbles that burst, to panics, and so on. World history has shown this over the last 300 years when capitalism has been around. Capitalism is not as stable as we thought it was. It has self-corrective features, but we have to accept there is a certain amount of uncertainty and risk in capitalism. And the too big to fail idea causes moral hazard. I don't need to say anyone in this room this. Excessive risk-taking by the banks, because if things go well, you get the profit, you pocket the profit. If things go badly, then you shift the bill over to the taxpayers. And we see also now more clearly than we did 5 years ago, that a lot of the financial crisis can be ascribed to government failure. Subprime loans in the US, low interest rates by the American Fed, and excessive government expenditure in Europe. And essentially, I think that the causes of the crisis were bad government policies and the inability of the market to price risk correctly. We haven't really found the financial techniques to price risk correctly. We thought we had, but it turned out that it did not. But I wanted just to illustrate very briefly that Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Slovenia, Romania, and Ireland, they suffered greater GDP contraction in 2009 than Iceland did. So just to put it all in perspective, we were not worst hit in terms of a recession or a crisis, although we thought so at the time. And I don't buy the argument either that our banking sector was too big. We see that if we use this measurement or ratio of short-term liabilities to GDP, that Switzerland and Iceland and United Kingdom, there was no great difference in the relative size of the banking sector in those countries. And were the Icelandic bankers reckless? Surely they were. But so were bankers elsewhere else. We see now news of the Barclays being fined £290 million for fixing rates. HSBC fined almost 2 billion for money laundering. Goldman Sachs fined 550 million for misleading investors. And RBS, UBS, Credit Suisse, Danske Bank all bailed out during the crisis, which meant obviously that they had done something wrong before. So recklessness is not an Icelandic specialty. It is a feature of the international banking system. And we were no less regulated than others. There is the myth that in Iceland there was a neoliberal experiment and that we had deregulated everything. The financial markets were regulated in precisely the same way as financial markets elsewhere in Europe. The reserve requirements of banks were the same. They had been reduced, but only to make them compatible with reserve requirements in other European countries. So that is not the explanation, the free market reforms, although there was a comprehensive program of free market reforms which took place in 1991 to 2004. But the aim of that was to bring Iceland into line with the other Nordic countries, so Denmark, Norway, United Kingdom, Ireland, our neighboring countries. I have to declare a personal interest in this. This is a dinner party that we held on the first day of the Oddsson government on the 30th of April 1991, and I was present there. So I was pretty close to those who were making the policies at that time. But I'm just showing this to tell you, don't look at the person who is talking. Look at the evidence he is presenting. I think that is essential for us. And what happened in 1991 to 2004 was that we cut corporate subsidies. We emptied the waiting room of the Prime Minister, essentially. We reduced taxes, corporate tax from 45% to 18%. Other taxes were simplified and reduced, like the wealth tax was abolished, the estate tax was cut very extensively. We privatized and we used the revenue to pay up the public debt. So in 2004, there was no public debt to speak of. We stabilized the economy, inflation was brought down, it had been quite high before. And very importantly, we established an efficient, or we developed further an efficient system in the fisheries, the system of so-called individual transferable quotas that works much better than any other known system of managing the fisheries. It's essentially a system of private use rights that are transferable, that can be bought and sold. So our fisheries are profitable, whereas fisheries elsewhere in Europe, they are operated with a loss. We did extensive pension reforms, so the Icelandic pension system is quite sustainable. We have the second strongest pension system in the world after the Netherlands. We did a lot of legal reforms, like in public administration and in information, defending the right of the individual against the system. And the consequence of all those reforms that were implemented in 1991 to 2004 was that Iceland had a very good reputation, and that meant that we had very high ratings by the ratings companies. So when we had another dinner, when Davíð Oddsson left office on the 15th of September 2004, we could look proudly back to those 13 and a half years of reforms. And here you can see what, in a sense, is a cause of the Icelandic bubble. Because we had such high ratings that there was almost unlimited access by Icelandic banks to money abroad. And that was because of the reforms from 1991 to 2004. So paradoxically, you can say that Oddsson's sound policies caused the bubble because it raised so much our ratings that the banks could borrow as much as they wanted. I think, though, that if you look at the Icelandic bubble, that 2004 was a crucial year. And here you can see an astonishing graph. And this is the external debt of Iceland in millions of kronur. And you can see very well that the bubble started very clearly in 2004 and became extraordinary, the borrowing, the leverage of the banks. So that's a crucial year. And I think that you can explain it partly, although I don't think it's the main cause of the collapse of the banks. But you can explain partly what happened by a transfer in Iceland or a change in Iceland from market capitalism to crony capitalism. The market capitalism of the years 1991 to 2004, they implied competition in an independent judiciary, free media, economic power separated from political power. But there was a change in 2004. There was a change. If I was an Italian Marxist and if I believed in Antonio Gramsci, I would say it was a battle about the intellectual and political hegemony of Iceland, which was lost by Oddsson and won by a tycoon called Jón Ásgeir Jóhannesson, who ran Baugur, which was a corporate entity. So I think that we can describe the years from 2004 to 2008 as those of oligopoly, oligarchs owning the media. They were supported by politicians, and they supported them financially as well. And the judiciary was cooperative. Everybody seemed to be participating in a Klondike dream, in a bubble where all the prices went up all the time, and they went up because asset prices went up, and they went up because of the heavy borrowing abroad that we saw before on the graph. And if we look at the bubble, then the Special Investigation Commission of the Parliament that was doing research on the economy, they basically divided the businesses in Iceland into 3 business conglomerates. One was the Baugur group, another one was the Exeter group, and the third one was the Landsbanki group. And you can see there on the graph, their total loans in the Icelandic banking system, and you can see there very clearly that it was a Baugur bubble, that the other 2 groups didn't get as leveraged by far as Baugur did. It was in a special field of its own, and those figures all that are in this graph, I just took them straight from the report of the Special Investigation Commission of Parliament. So these are not my figures. And what was the money used for? Well, here we have Jóhannesson's luxury apartment in Manhattan.
Not too bad.
And here we have his private jet. And here we have his private yacht. So, you know, some of it was put into those uses. So, essentially, we had the international risk in 2007 to 8 that we had to face, which is moral hazard, government mistakes, difficulty of pricing risks. Then we had additional systemic risks in Iceland alone. And these risks were basically twofold. One was that there was too much cross-ownership, too many overvalued assets, too much borrowing in the system, because this Baugur group also had a bank and they had easy access to credit in other banks and so on. So we had this systemic risk. Then we had another additional systemic risk, which is the fact that under the EEA, the operational field of the banks was the whole of Europe, but the institutional support field was Iceland alone. Or so it turned out, because what happened was that people in Iceland thought that we would get credit lines and we would get support from other central banks and so on, because we were all a part of the same whole, we were all operating in the same market, so that there would be backup from somebody else. But in the crisis, it turned out that the only institution backing the Icelandic banks was the Icelandic Central Bank. And we'll see that in a moment. Basically, into this weak situation with systemic risks in the Icelandic situation entered 3 decisions that were crucial to bringing down the Icelandic financial sector. One of them was a decision taken on the 24th of September 2008, when the American federal system announced that they had extended currency swap agreements to the Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian central banks, essentially giving them license to print dollars, 15 billion to Denmark, 15 billion to Norway, 30 billion to Sweden. Then, I think, you could see that the Icelandic banking system was doomed. The financial markets noticed, oh, there was no currency swap agreement with Iceland. And it wasn't really reported publicly at that moment, but we had asked, or the Icelandic Central Bank had asked for such currency swap agreements, but had been refused. Then, on the 7th of October, the British Labour government closed the 2 Icelandic banks in London, Heritable Bank and Singer and Friedlander, and 5 minutes later, they announced a very extensive rescue package for all other banks in the United Kingdom. And then the next day, the British Labour government used an anti-terrorism law against one of the Icelandic banks, briefly actually putting the Ministry of Treasury and the central bank on a list of terrorist organizations. And you could then see for a day or two the Icelandic treasury, a nation that has no military even, in a list with the Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the governments of Sudan and North Korea. And this was totally unbelievable to most Icelanders, but the results were that all transfers to and from Iceland suddenly cut, and there was an emergency plan implemented by the central bank so that people could have their credit cards maintained abroad, so that we could have medicine and food imported and so on. But you have to realize that London is such a strong financial center that once a big Icelandic bank is put on a list of terrorist organizations, almost immediately everything is frozen and you can't do anything, you can't move any money anywhere. So this was the heaviest blow of them all to the Icelanders. So these three decisions entered a precarious, vulnerable situation. And this meant that what we could have done, learning from Urban Bäckström and others who implemented the rescue plan here in Sweden, we couldn't do anything like that. We were just victims laying on the ground, and this meant that there were immense losses. As you can see here on the slide, the asset management section of Singer and Friedlander was sold for 5 million. It was worth about 30 million pounds. Glitnir in Norway, that was a rather interesting story. It had been bought a year before for 3 billion Norwegian kroner, but it was sold to a group of savings banks for 300 million Norwegian kroner. And then when one begins to investigate it a little bit further, the reason Glitnir Bank was sold in a fire sale was that the fund of depositors and investors, the guarantee fund of depositors and investors, made all kinds of claims on them, so they had to sell. And to whom did they sell? They did sell to this group of savings banks. Who was the leader of the group of the savings banks that bought Glitnir Bank? His name was Finn Haugen, who was the chairman of the board of the guarantee fund for depositors and investors, the same Finn Haugen. He said that he had not attended the meeting where the decision about Glitnir Bank was made, but this doesn't look very good. And then in January 2009, a month after the bank had been sold for 300 million, it was entered at a value of 2 billion in the books of the buyers. So this situation that we had in Iceland meant that a lot of our assets were sold wildly underpriced. So one can ask the question then, and I'm not entirely sure about the answer. Was Iceland taken down, or did it collapse under its own weight? You can basically argue for both positions, but there are some evidence that Iceland was taken down, namely the refusal of the American Fed to have currency swap agreements with Iceland, and the closure of the Icelandic banks in London, and the invoking of the anti-terrorist law by the British Labour government. And why would Iceland be taken down? I mean, what rationale would there be for that? Because I don't think anyone considers Iceland an enemy. That's not really the case. Well, the Icelandic banks, they were rather efficient, well-run banks, computerized, modern, and their operation costs were lower than many of the other banks that had their large operations. And I think that the Icelanders were perceived as new kids on the block, upstarts, uppkomlingar, and there was antipathy from old players. So there was a resentment and some hostility towards the Icelandic banks in the international banking sector because they offered competition. And then it may also be that there had been some hostility to the Icelanders because of these ideas that perhaps Iceland could function as a financial center, similar to the Isle of Man, offering low corporate taxes and attracting capital and corporations like Jersey and Guernsey and so on. It never actually was implemented, it never became a reality, but the idea was floating around. So one is trying to find some explanations for this hostility towards the banks. One is the one that I mentioned before, but there are several other things, perhaps a bit anecdotal in nature, like the fact that in 2005, MI5, the British Secret Service, investigated the Icelandic banks because of some suspicion that there was Russian mafia money there. It didn't lead anywhere, and in my judgment, it's a fantasy. There was no Russian mafia money in the Icelandic banks. Alistair Darling had some strange comments in his memoirs about the crisis. He was a key person in the whole setting. He said, for example, that the Icelandic bankers in London, they had contributed heavily to the Conservative Party funds. I have actually asked them, I know most of them, and none of them tells me that this is really the case. This seems to be pure fantasy, a pure invention of Alistair Darling, but it is interesting that he mentions this in his memoirs and that he believes that they were funding, with others of course, the Conservative Party. And then many Labour-controlled municipalities, they kept their money in Icelandic bank accounts, and there was a hysteria. You have to remember that those were hectic days in early October 2008. And I think Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling were under political pressure from those municipalities. But then, of course, there may also be that Gordon Brown, he thought like the Athenians in the dialogue against Melos. You are weak, we are strong. There are no moral laws constraining us. We can take you down, and we can have a nice Falklands factor by showing strength, by flexing muscle towards the Icelanders, because the Icelanders at that time were expendable. They were small, that didn't matter, didn't cost anything to take them down. Perhaps a PR stunt. And this can be put into perspective when we see how much the American Federal Reserve System helped other banks. These are aggregate transactions. They took never place at the same time. There's never borrowing at the same time amounting to those staggering figures. But the European Central Bank got 8,000 billion, the Bank of England 900 billion, the Bank of Switzerland, and that's very interesting because Switzerland had a very large banking sector, got in aggregate 466 billion in currency swap agreements with the United States, which meant essentially that the bank, the central bank, the National Bank of Switzerland, got an unlimited license to print dollars. And this enabled them to rescue UBS and Credit Suisse. So the difference between the Icelandic banks and those in Swiss was that the Icelandic banks were not rescued because there was no currency swap agreement, but the Swiss banks were rescued with a very large financial sector. And in Denmark, for example, 73 billion, which enabled the Danish central bank to rescue Danske Bank. So we have here, what could have happened. I believe personally that it was a blessing in disguise that we were not rescued, that the banks were not bailed out. You have to correct errors. You shouldn't throw money at errors. But what happened was, because of those decisions made, the whole system became unmanageable. We should have defaulted the banks. We should have put some of them in receivership and so on. But we lost a lot, and the whole banking sector collapsed, in my opinion, needlessly. The bubble had to burst. We had to do what the Swedes did to take the equity away from the bankers that had borrowed too much, couldn't sustain themselves. Of course, we ought to do that. But this is something different from a whole collapse of the banks, which seemed at that time also to be a collapse of our society, because this was such a shock to us what was happening. And there were forebodings, as there are in all Greek tragedies and also in the Icelandic sagas. It's a very interesting thing what happened on the 30th of July, 2008. There was a high official in the international financial sector who came to do salmon fishing in Iceland, and he was invited to dinner by the Icelandic governor. And he said to the Icelandic governor on the 30th of July, 2008, I believe that in the next few months, as a warning to others, And in order to gain control of the markets and to send signal to the markets, one bank will be taken down. And I predict it will be Lehman Brothers. And I also think that for the same reasons, one small country that doesn't make much of a difference will be taken down, and I predict it will be Iceland. Amazing, because this happened just a few months before Lehman Brothers collapsed on the 15th of September, and before Iceland collapsed on the 7th of October. And then, of course, the IMF got involved with the Icelandic situation, and we took, in our desperation, a loan, an unnecessary loan from the IMF in 2009. It was unnecessary because it was just a currency reserve fund for us, and it was kept in a bank account in New York and never used, and we had to pay immense interest rates on it. And our governor at that time, he said, well, we don't need this loan because everything has collapsed. We don't need a loan after things have collapsed. And then the IMF official said, well, we have to live too, because you have to realize the IMF is in business, and it is in business of lending to countries. So in a sense, it is in their interest to turn healthy people into patients, because then there is a call for the doctor's services. So my lessons, and these are the two last slides in my talk. There are lessons for, I think, for the world from the crisis. And there is a flaw in the argument that we need more regulation, because we had extensive regulation before the crisis, and that failed. So should we have more of what failed? The more the merrier. It doesn't sound quite right to me. It was the wrong kind of regulation, not that it was too little regulation before the crisis. And there are actually risks involved with too strict regulation of banks. It is that it creates false security, especially, I think, harmonization of rules about banks and other financial institutions. They create an additional systemic risk, because if everybody is structured in the same way, then if there is a weakness in that very way, then it will lead to the collapse of a whole banking sector. But if they are different, if they're heterogeneous, the institutions and the corporations in the banking sector, then you are dispersing risk in a better way. And we have to try to find techniques to price risks better than we did now, and we can only do that with competition and diversity in the financial markets. And I think that, for example, the Glass-Steagall Act in the US, it may have been wrong to repeal it, but not because there is anything causing bubbles inherently in investment banks and normal banks being run together. It is more that you have a bigger entity. The Glass-Steagall Act kept the size of banks down. So you didn't have too much of the too big to fail idea there. So we have to find ways of keeping the size of banks so small that they don't constitute systemic risks. And I think that out of this crisis, capitalism is still the only game in town. And I tell my students and I tell my audiences in Iceland that the great news in the first decade of the 21st century is not really the financial crisis. It is the emergence of China and India as members of world capitalism. And according to the projections by the IMF, they who started with 7% of world production, they will in 2017 produce 1/4, 25% of world production. And they are the great challenges. And this is the big news. And this is what we have to cope with. And we can only do it by cutting taxes and stimulating economic growth. Then what is the lesson for my small country, the Melos, dealing with the Athens of this world? We were left out in the cold in 2008, and that illustrates that a small country like Iceland, it needs a shelter. But the shelter mustn't become a trap, as happened in the Middle Ages when we were really entrapped by our union with the Norwegian king, who was there to protect us and to ensure trade with us, but it became a trap for a few hundred years. I believe, contrary to probably what many people in Sweden think, that the EU is not for us such a shelter. Well, I am a pro-European. And I would actually, if I was in Estonia and Finland, be a pro-European Union person. But I think that there are three belts in Europe. There is an inner core of Germany and France, and they have a project that I applaud of turning swords into plows and making peace. There is an outer belt, the non-Eurozone Europe, consisting of Sweden and Denmark and the United Kingdom. And then there is a third belt consisting of Switzerland and Norway and Iceland that are outside both the Eurozone and the European Union. And I think there is something natural about it, because those marginal countries in Europe, like Norway and Iceland, they don't really belong to this continental project. Others belong to it, and I applaud it, and I wish well for it, but it is not really our home. I think that we are much better off in Iceland by trying to get a shelter with our Anglo-Saxon neighbors, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. And I think there obviously was a mistake made in the years before the collapse, when we drifted away from our traditional British allies, with the result that they came down on us, and also that we were abandoned by the United States, that had been our traditional ally, had undertaken our defense, and been a shelter to us in the Cold Wars with the United Kingdom. So I think that we have to learn from this, to a small country to get allies, and we do not have the same situation as in 417 before Christ, when Melos and Athens were having this dialogue, and the Athens were only speaking from strength, because I think that the Anglo-Saxon powers are limited, constrained by the great Anglo-Saxon tradition of liberty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannes Gissurarson. I think you can sit down. We will be back to you soon, but first we're going to listen to a comment and a speech by Mr. Urban Bäckström, who is CEO of Swedish Industry, who was former central bank governor, and who also during the 90 crisis during the 90s in Sweden, was sitting in the Minister of Finance trying to handle that. So please take the floor. It's yours.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Hannes, for a very interesting and informative talk. Unfortunately, I do not have the answer to your very central question: why was Iceland left out in the cold? And thinking back to the Swedish crisis, we were all also left out in the cold when it happened in the early 90s. And I think the conclusion from that is, don't put yourself in that kind of situation, so you have to rely on the outside world for help. But I think your talk raises a number of interesting questions. First of all, the Icelandic situation in itself, but also more broader, what is a financial crisis, and what sort of nature what's the inner cause of a financial crisis, and what did actually happen around the world, because Iceland was not at all the only country in the world that faced a financial crisis. And finally, does that raise any question about our economic system, our capitalistic system, market economy system? Is there something wrong here? And there are too many questions for me to comment on 5 to 10 minutes, but I'm sure many authors and academic people will spend years on these kind of topics. What I can do is only to touch very briefly on some of the points here. Comparing the Icelandic crisis with the Swedish crisis is quite interesting. I saw somewhere that GDP in Iceland fell from top to bottom about 12%. And in Sweden, the equivalent figure is 6%, so roughly twice as serious as the Swedish crisis in the early 1990s. And public sector costs have been calculated by OECD to be around 20% of GDP for Iceland. And in Sweden, we were able to recapture most of the costs for the financial crisis in the early 1990s. And also Iceland had to choose, well, not choose, had to face a totally different rescue operation than many other countries, including Sweden. More or less bankruptcy were sort of used more dramatically and not a rescue operation in an orderly fashion. And there were no possibility to do that. Too much money were involved. So in a way, the concept of too big to fail, in Iceland, it was more or less too big to rescue. Because there were too much money involved. And it was indeed a dramatic crisis for an outside observer. But we've seen many financial crises around the world during the last 5-6 years, which is quite interesting. It's the worst crisis since 1930s. And the question is, what went wrong here? We can look at history, and looking back in history, we see that financial crises are not at all a modern phenomenon. I read somewhere that they were quite common, for instance, in the United States during the 19th century. And in fact, in the US, they appeared to have a financial crisis almost every decade during the 1990s. And then at the time, we had free capital markets as well. Looking at Sweden, we had financial crises, some more severe than others, starting 1857. Next one came 1878, and then the international crisis 1907, 1921 and 1930s, in the beginning of the 1930s, and then a jump up to the 1990s. So we have had several crises in our countries, and that goes for many other countries. And the discussion about financial crisis is not at all new. There is an example of a major debate in the 1920s and the 1930s between Austrians, Hayek, for instance, and on the one hand, and Keynes on the other side. And in a nutshell, that discussion was about Keynes focusing on the demand side and how to get out of the burst, while Hayek was focusing on the supply side and how an economy got into the bust in the first place. But we know that politicians at the time, of course, were more interested in how to get out of the crisis. So in a way, Keynes got the leading role. And when I studied economics, not at least with you, we did never read anything about financial crisis and the discussion before 1930s. And that's probably why decision makers around the world never sort of confronted the issue. And that's why probably it happened. So what shall we do? What went wrong? Shall we rethink the macro architecture, or shall we even rethink our economic system? My answer is yes and no. I've got a diagram here which is quite interesting. It's the GDP per capita in Sweden since 1720 up to now, more or less. And we see the break in the middle of the 19th century. GDP per capita moving up sharply, and still is. And we cannot see any signs of a financial crisis there. Not the 1857, not this 1878, not the 1907, not even the 30s or the 20s. So basically our economic system is producing wealth and prosperity at a rather rapid pace. And there is a break there in the middle of 1800 probably because of all the institutional reforms that were introduced at the time and shaped a market economy and that paid off much later. So overall, the Swedish economy is working quite well, looking from that diagram. So that goes for many other countries if you walk around the world. So my point is only that the economic system, the capitalistic system, the market economy system is not so at stake here. And the events have been rather dramatic, but not so dramatic that we have to question our basic economic system. But what we have to do is to question the architecture of our macroeconomic policy system, to my mind. And it's not the non-financial world that is in deep trouble. It's rather the financial world. And what we have seen many times now during the 1990s and also during the 2000s is that financial market could behave extremely irrational, engage in herd behavior, and when that explodes, it creates fragility. So the question is, how do we sort of dampen the development of debt levels and protect sort of the economy from getting into speculation bubbles? I think it's interesting to note that when debt is not associated with a financial bubble, it doesn't hurt the economy when it explodes. And the example here is obvious, the IT bubble in the stock market. It produced a very shallow recession in the beginning of 2000, but not anything dramatic, because debts were not associated with that bubble. It had some wealth effects, but nothing compared to a financial crisis. But coming to this latest crisis, when debt level were extremely high in many countries, when the asset bubble bursted, it had dramatic consequences, and Iceland being a very prominent example here, of course. So what is the Western world doing now? Or perhaps the whole world? Well, first of all, dealing with the immediate crisis. But second, trying to make the banking system more robust. Imagine a situation when you walk into a bank office and you have this great idea of doing business and wanted to borrow some money. And you present the business like this. First of all, I would like to borrow short and invest long. And then I will put up extremely a small fraction of equity in the investment. I want to borrow the rest from you. What's the answer from the banker? Will he do it? Definitely no. Still, that's exactly what banking is. Mismatch of maturities, borrowing short, lending long, and have an extremely small proportion of equity capital in the balance sheet. 3 to 5% or something like that, maybe 5-6. So the question is, by raising capital buffers in the banking system, will that help mitigating future financial crises? I must say, I doubt it. This is a very interesting graph. It is about the proportion of equity to total assets in the US banking system from 1840 up to now, or up to 1993. So we see the equity proportion was, in the starting of the diagram, around 55%, and is now calculated in this way between 5 and 10, something like that. But you remember I said that the US had financial crisis every decade during the 1800s, and still the proportion of equity was quite high during that period. So I'm not sure that this will sort of protect us from future financial crises. And that brings me to the third aspect here, which many governments is engaged in. Trying to introduce tools to dampen future financial cycles. And the buzzword here is macroprudentials. Is there a tool that could sort of hold back the lending expansion in the banking system? And there are many tools that could probably help doing that. But the question here is, who should do that? Who should have the responsibility to introduce those or maneuver those macroprudential tools? Should it be the FSA, or should it be the central bank, or should the FSA and the central bank merge to sort of a larger entity, and that entity holding this or these tools and implementing them? Let us think about the situation when an authority should start using those tools. And probably that's a situation where the problems is not imminent. I mean, the buzzword for the central bank is to do things preemptively. It's not obvious to the population at large or the political system that there is an emerging problem. To gradually implement those macroprudential tools. There will be heavy criticism. And we remember that when the FSA here in Sweden a couple of years ago introduced lånetaket. So what kind of protection must that kind of authority have? Should it be very directly guided by the political system, the minister responsible for the area, or should it be more sort of independent? And I am leaning, of course, towards that authority being much more independent from the day-to-day politics. I would say that raising rates in a preemptive fashion would be, as we say in Swedish, a västanfläkt compared to a situation where macroprudential tools should be introduced. And that is probably why the Swedish situation is now, one can say that the private financial sector is in a situation where lending levels are among the highest in EU or OECD area. And that could be quite dangerous. I'm not saying that the financial crisis is imminent, and I'm not saying we are in a bubble in the Swedish economy. But of course, if lending levels in the private non-financial sector is higher than it was in the USA when the bubble bursted, it's higher than in the UK when the bubble bursted, and it's higher, not Iceland, but some other countries when bubbles have burst in the past. That makes, of course, the Swedish economy quite vulnerable. And we haven't seen any macroprudential tools being implemented yet, but that might come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Urban. Please stand, Hannes. First, I was a bit curious because the description of what was happening in Iceland is quite different between you two, even though you are uniting in some conclusions. Because what you said, Hannes, you said that looking at the banking sector in Iceland, it was not really that huge. It was big, but it wasn't that huge. While you were saying, Urban, that the problem with the banks in Iceland was that they were not too big to fail, but they were too big to save. And looking at the banks in Iceland, Landsbanki, Glitnir and Kaupthing, they had a balance sheet roughly 11 times the GDP of the entire country. Wasn't that really extreme? What do you say, Hannes?
Well, I agree with Urban that a banking sector in a country has to be sustainable, and you really have to be in a situation where you can help yourself. That's sound advice. But if we look at what happened in the financial crisis was that, for example, the Swedish central bank got a lot of currency swap agreements with the United States, and they must have got it in order to save their banks. So they were not precisely sustainable. The clearest case being Switzerland, which had about the same proportional bank sector as Iceland did, namely roughly 10% of GDP. It was only for a moment that it was 11 times, so 10 times the GDP, and they got enormous sums from the American Federal Reserve System. So the Swiss banking sector was not sustainable by itself, because if it was, they wouldn't have needed the currency swap agreements with the United States. On the other hand, I would agree, both with observers and critics of the Icelandic system, that our banks grew too rapidly, and we had not made all of the arrangements that you do have to have if you are going to have a large banking sector. One of them being a sense of understanding with the countries that are hosts to the banks, like Sweden or Denmark or the United Kingdom. There was animosity. They just grew too rapidly, they were too aggressive, they didn't consider the rules of the game, that you are really entering a club and you should treat more carefully than they did. That would be my opinion on it, but the final observation would be that I don't think that the assets of the Icelandic banks that were brought down were worse, that the credit was worse than credit elsewhere. It has been shown when they have been wrapped up now that the return to them is not worse than in other banks.
I read actually a quotation, and it goes like this. They, that means Icelandic, created fake capital by trading assets amongst themselves at inflated values. You have a dog and I have a cat. We agree that each is worth $1 billion. You sell me the dog, I sell you the cat. Now we're no longer pet owners, but Icelandic banks with $1 billion in new assets. Your reaction, Urban?
Maybe I misunderstand you, Hannes, but I hear you saying that Iceland was in the hands of the international community, and because it was mistreated, all these bad things happened. My reading of the financial crisis, including the Swedish one, is you have to be very careful when you expand financially as a country, because otherwise they could end up in a situation when you are vulnerable, that if you are not helped by larger countries, you will end up in difficulties. And the conclusion from that is to don't do it. And I mean, this diagram shows how vulnerable the banking system is, with such a low proportion of equity to total assets. But there is another problem too, mismatch in currencies. And the central bank is lender of last resort in the domestic currency, not in foreign currency. They only have the currency reserve, and that's limited. And the foreign currency reserve, when that is blown away because banks do have to lend them, there's nothing you can do. You can, of course, on your knee, beg to other countries, give us a swap agreement, but central banks around the world will have to rely on liquidity, not on equity. That's where the taxpayers comes into the picture. And I think the discussion would be more fruitful if we focused on how should we protect ourselves, not getting into that kinds of problem, rather than blaming the outside world. Am I provoking you?
No, I actually agree partly with your statement and with your analysis. You described actually quite correctly what I believe that the dominant business conglomerate in Iceland did, because they had inflated assets and all kind of cross ownership and so on. But I'm not entirely sure, even if this is a true account of what happened, that this was the cause of the collapse of the banking sector. We have to distinguish between a crisis, which was obvious. It was a bubble that burst, and as you pointed correctly out, we have to realize that such bubbles are going to arise and they're going to burst, and we have to do something about it and try to cope with them and try to reduce them. What was crucial was that we didn't, for example, get what the Swiss got. Look at UBS, which is one of the most respected and biggest banks in the world. It had actually failed once before the crash, because then it had to get an injection of money from the Singapore Sovereign Fund, and then the American Fed got enormous amounts of money into the Swiss system. I think the price that the Swiss had to pay for it is that they had to release data about American citizens, but that's a different thing. But you know, the Swiss system wasn't sustainable, so I'm not holding it against the Icelandic system that it was not sustainable. Many other systems were not, but they did not collapse because they got injections of money from the American Fed. And then, in addition to this, we got those extraordinary decisions by the British Labour government to close the Icelandic banks while all other banks in England were saved, and to invoke the anti-terrorist law on us. I'm not saying that the Icelanders are not to blame, because they grew too rapidly, they were too reckless, but when we look at other countries, that was my point, then we see just the same picture, but the difference being that they got currency swap agreements and they didn't get an assault from the British.
But there is a difference, isn't there? I mean, you were pointing at the year 2004 as being crucial, because then you say there was a change from market capitalism into crony capitalism. If you look at the stock market, for example, between 2003 and 2007, the American stock market doubled between 2003 and 2007, but the stock market in Iceland grew 9 times. Couldn't you have seen the signals there that something was not really going right?
You're absolutely right. And this was a concern of some people, like Governor Oddsson of the central bank. He warned against this several times. I didn't believe him. I thought it was just rapid growth. But I see by hindsight that somewhat it was artificial stimulus because of too much leverage and too much cross ownership and so on. So I agree with you. But that's one thing. That's a correct description of the situation. Then the explanation for the collapse of the banking system is a different matter conceptually, I think.
I'm soon going to let you in from the audience. Just letting Urban have a comment first.
Maybe we could take some comfort in Mark Twain's word. A banker is a person who will lend his umbrella to you when the sun is shining. When the rain comes, he would like to have it back. Right. And the question is, don't go, and the conclusion is, don't go out when it's raining. Don't put you in that kind of situation. I think that's the obvious conclusion for you, but also for Sweden and many other countries having faced these kinds of crises. But the question, you're coming back to those swap agreements, but that's only liquidity. I would imagine that there were fairly large holes in the balance sheets in the Icelandic banks. And that is money that couldn't come from swap agreements or sort of liquidity injections. That must be taxpayers' money.
Well, just a short comment to this. Again, there is a point there which can be taken. It was not only a liquidity crisis, it was also an equity crisis. Yeah. That is to say, bad credit, bad assets of the banks. But it turns out, though, when the banks are now being taken and reorganized and so on, that the assets were not nearly as bad as they looked to be at that time. So it's a mixed picture, but I agree with you. It was not only a liquidity crisis in Iceland, but was it also only a liquidity crisis in other countries? Do not we have a lot of bad credit, say, in Greece and Cyprus? So
we haven't seen the end of it. Maybe there are holes out in some banks' balance sheets still around the world, and we will only see that later on. So this drama has not ended yet.
It's interesting because both of you have a background being members of the central bank. From your perspective, Urban, when they were in the middle of the crisis, the Icelandic and Hannes here, do you think they should have done something differently taken some other decisions than
You mean in the middle of the crisis?
in the middle of a crisis in Iceland?
No, it's very difficult for me to have a view on that, how to manage the crisis, because there's so much going on in the middle of crisis. But the conclusion is, could they or Sweden or other countries have been doing something differently before the crisis, in the run-up to the dramatic events? And that brings us to macroprudentials, for instance, and how that is organized, and if the tool will be potent enough to do something. I don't think personally that we could ever avoid a financial crisis in the future, but maybe we could do something to sort of dampening it a little bit with macroprudentials.
So it doesn't become so extreme. I got 2 questions from the audience. First one there. 3.
I think one of the most important things is to look upon Iceland in more of an historical point of view. I was following Iceland in the 80s and the 90s. You had 2 things at that time. You had the aluminium plantations and you had the fishery. You didn't have any real knowledge of international banking or of international investments. You had one more very good thing. You had a very young society, and a society of eager businessmen who didn't really have the social international network for getting mixed into these financial crises, like Union Bank of Switzerland, that rated one of the highest banks before their collapse. And because of that, there were these very highly leveraged credits. They wanted to grow and own part of the international society without really having any money. And it was accepted to get into it with this very highly leverage, but the lack was the history of what can come out of it. And I think that's why Union Bank of Switzerland was saved, that's why Royal Bank of Scotland and all these other ones, they were part of the international financial society. And sadly enough, you have to belong to a very important network to succeed. I hope these young people have grown a little bit more wise now, and that they also feel that you have to climb very smoothly into a social international network. Thank you.
Others have said that as well. You shouldn't have went into banking, you should stay on fishing.
I must say that I completely agree with you. And I think you read quite correctly the flaws in the system in Iceland, and that the Icelandic banks, they were characterized by what you could call innocent arrogance. They were innocent because they didn't really realize that the iron rules of the game are different from what they imagined. But they were arrogant as well. They thought that they could take on the whole world. And that was one of the reasons for this hostility, which was again one of the reasons for the Icelandic banks not being helped. So I think you are describing something quite important.
Urban.
Taking on the whole world, that was precisely what happened during the late 80s when Swedish businessmen went abroad and educated all other Europeans how to invest in real estates. And I remember that one of the real estates that later on became a credit loss for SEB was the Eurotower in Frankfurt. And during my first meeting there, preparing the monetary union together with all the colleagues, was that Wim Duisenberg said, this is a credit loss from the Swedish financial crisis, but that will now, this building will now be bought by someone else. And Urban, please use the money to pay back the state debt, the public debt. And I was all red because this was not precisely what I wanted to discuss there. So this is very typical, going back to probably all financial crises, that the domestic businessmen would like to educate the rest of the world how to do business. So I wouldn't say that any special for Iceland, it goes for all of us.
Marian.
I would like to have a comment from both Hannes and Urban about the forthcoming financial crisis. I would like to turn the vista into the future. As a result of the past crisis, and because of the danger felt by many that we may fall down again, that there will be a new crisis developing, the central banks in many countries are pumping huge amounts of money into the system in the United States, in Europe, and more recently in Japan. Huge amounts are being pumped out. As soon as there is an indication, as there was in the United States, that they may go slow on this, there are reactions on the stock markets, and I believe that it will be very difficult to turn down the liquidity increase. And as the liquidity is being turned down, there is a great danger of a relapse into a new financial crisis. Do you agree with me? And how do you see the danger?
Who would like to start? Hannes, please.
Yes. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, people were very optimistic. They thought that they had re-entered the golden age before 1914. But there were two differences between the pre-1914 world and the post-1991 world, even if there were many similarities. The similarities being that we had a united Europe, we could travel around without permits or without passports, and we had a wonderful time, and Francis Fukuyama said that this was the end of history as we knew it, and the total triumph of democratic liberalism. But there were two jokers in the equation. One was that we only had fiat money, whereas before 1914 we had the gold standard. So we had this immense problem that you correctly described, that the people now have been able to increase the money supply. There is too much liquidity in the system, and you have to, when it will be drained out, we will have probably another recession. The other difference, the first one is that we only have fiat money now, whereas before 1914 we had the gold standard. The other difference is that now we have the welfare state with all those entitlements, all those commitments that it's difficult for us to get rid of. And if we look at the European situation, we see that we have excessive government expenditure, and we have the same in the United States, and a total political unwillingness to tackle the problem. And that brings me a little bit to Sweden, because I have been impressed by a lot of things in Sweden. And I wanted just to mention that in the midst of the crisis, even if he's not in the same party as I am, Göran Persson, he came to Iceland. I think it was perhaps in November 2008. And he said to us, he gave a very strong speech. He said, now you should unite on solving the problem and put out all political weapons, all your armory, and just concentrate together on solving the problems. And I think that's precisely what the Swedes did in the early 1990s, Urban and others leading the way. What they did, they had the political will to reform. But I don't see that political will in Europe and in the United States because of this those disputes in the American Congress about fiscal policy and so on. So I am rather apprehensive. I would share your analysis and your apprehensions about the future, not for Sweden as much as for the rest of the world.
How worried are you, Urban?
I think this is, Marianne, a very interesting and important question. My answer goes like this, and it's divided in two parts. First of all, I'm not at all worried about the huge liquidity that is in the system now with this kind of economic development, given that there is a credible exit strategy.
Is there?
And that's the second part of the answer. Going back, we can see how that has worked before. What happened after the savings and loan crisis in the United States? Well, Fed brought down short-term interest rates in the beginning of the 1990s to fairly low level, not to these levels, but to fairly low levels. And the exit strategy from that came during 1994. And maybe some of us remember what happened during the 1994 when Fed raised rates the 1st of February 1994. Well, there was a tremendous volatility in the bond market. Long-term bond yields went up sharply, and it affected Sweden, where bond yields went up from roughly 6-7% up to 13%. And that was the case in some other countries too. It was really a dramatic event. So sorting out the previous bubble in the savings and loans market led to a new situation where huge volatility was created. That, I think, many central bankers around the world put in their minds and remember after dealing with the dot-com bubble later on, where they stimulated the economies tremendously by lowering short-term rates. They didn't want to exit from that too rapidly because they remember the volatility from the previous time. So they stayed on too long, which helped create the present bubble. So your question is very valid. If they are afraid of the volatility that will obviously come when the exit strategy is implemented, if they are afraid of that, they could stay on too long and create the next bubble. And that is, to my mind, the key issue.
So what do you believe will happen?
Well, we saw Fed before the summer announcing that they will take the first step to do precisely that. That created volatility in the financial market, so they backed away. And that, to my mind, I don't have the answer, but I'm guessing, speculating, could have something to do with political pressure. And if that happens around the central banks all over the world, they will hesitate. And that doesn't make the credit strategy credible.
And that makes you believe that those tools that you were asking for should be placed not with FSA but with the central bank.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Hannes?
Well, I think we made a mistake in Iceland that the FSA, the Financial Supervisory Authority, was taken away from the central bank. So the central bank didn't have any information about the relative strengths and the weaknesses of the financial institutions and the real value of their assets. And it came as a shock to the central bank when it took over one of the three banks, indeed the bank in the ownership of Jón Ásgeir Jóhannesson, how weak the assets were and how much of it was overblown. So we didn't have that information. So in order to ensure financial stability, I think perhaps it wasn't a terribly good idea to divide up financial supervisory authorities on the one hand and central banks on the other hand, as we did.
They merged it in the United
Yes.
Kingdom. Yeah. I got a question there. Come with a microphone.
You mentioned about the swap agreements. How do you see the swap agreement between the central banks of Iceland and China?
That was a very specialized question.
I haven't really thought about that issue, but in our dire hour of need, what we did actually was to try to negotiate a bank with Russia, a loan with Russia, I mean. And they were quite willing to extend a loan to us. And this is a typical strategic move that a small country would do if it would feel abandoned by its traditional allies. It would try to get some other allies. And a third, and this actually we did in the 1950s when the British put a landing ban on Icelandic fish because of our extension of the fisheries limit. What did we do? We started to export fish to the Soviet Union. And the person who led that move was a known and staunch anti-communist and the leader of the Icelandic Independence Party. So it was logical for Melos to make an alignment with Sparta in the face of Athens, although Sparta is not a very pleasant country. So I think that in that situation it would have been on either to talk to China or to Russia, but it never happened though.
So how does that cope with your intention that you think that Iceland should strengthen its bond to the United Kingdom, to the United States, and to the Canada?
One way of strengthening a bond to somebody is to make them aware of that you can go somewhere else.
And what do you think are the reaction in the United Kingdom? Because the relations were quite frosty.
I think our problem is we are a small country, and the only people who take any interest in us are perhaps the Swedes and the Germans. They feel an affinity with us, and we do with them. We are a Nordic German culture, obviously. The problem with strengthening the bonds with the US and the UK is that they have not the slightest interest in us now, when we do not have the strategic position in the North Atlantic that we used to have with different setups in the international arena. But I think we should really change our foreign policy and approximate more the Anglo-Saxon powers.
Mm-hmm. And then I got a question over there.
Yes, I think these questions are very, very important. And I was thinking about the amount of money and the power of central banks. If I draw a note of 100 crowns, Swedish crowns, I would be put into jail for falsifying the note. Almost every country has legislation about monopoly of the central banks to control the currency. The situation today is that maybe so much as 97% of the money around are debt. Digital money created by the banks. Isn't it the right time to take back to the central banks the power of the currency and extend the monopoly to digital money and even bonds?
Do you want to answer that, Urban?
I don't think the answer lies there, but rather rethinking banking. What is a bank? What should a bank be? What kind of activities should a prudent bank do? And that is going on, and I think that's quite interesting. Maybe we went too far, allowing banks to have widespread activities, trading in their own books with shareholders' money and even depositors' money. Maybe we went too far there, but that's too early to tell.
Do you see the need for some sort of re-regulations?
Sorry?
Some sort of the need for a re-regulation?
I think it's always good if you sort of reconsider old regulations. But I think there's too big an appetite from the political system to do more regulations. And we do that after every crisis, and it doesn't help. So there is something more difficult here than sort of ask for more regulations. And we could also end up in a situation where we cross a line where banks could not fulfill their roles in our respective economies. And I'm not saying that that's imminent now, but somewhere along the lines it could happen. And that would be fearful. I mean, that will hurt economic growth, possibilities for companies to invest and to channel savings to the most profitable investment in our respective societies. That could be dangerous.
What's the situation like in Iceland, Hannes? Because you had also a situation where people were extremely angry with banks and bankers back in 2008, and you had a leftist government, and you did also have call for regulations, new regulations. What's it like right now?
Yes, I believe one of the graphs that I showed to you showed very well, or illustrated quite well, that the financial crisis did not hit us as hard as many other countries. But the shock was much greater because we were the first and the whole banking sector went under. So people thought that this was something like a Ragnarök in the old Edda. And this was a tremendous shock for the Icelanders. And it meant that the country took, in its opinion, public opinion, a sharp turn to the left. And there were street riots and there was violence. And street riots and violence are not really a part of the Icelandic tradition at all. So this was something that one looked at in astonishment. Now, a very hard left-wing government took power really on the 1st of February and started by persecuting political opponents, trying to brought the Prime Minister Geir Haarde to court, and he was acquitted of all serious charges. He was only convicted of something laughable, which was that he hadn't held enough ministerial meetings about the impending crisis. It was as if the mountains went into labor and a mouse came out, really, that trial. But it only showed that there was a sense of revenge and anger in the country, quite different from what Göran Persson advised us to do. And the governor, Davíð Oddsson, who had been the only person consistently warning against the expansion, credit expansion, he was driven from office. And there were a series of mistakes made by the left-wing government just because of this extreme hostility to the what we could call the ancien regime, because there had been so strong a dominance of Davíð Oddsson and his people before then. There was accumulated anger by those people who had been outside government for 18 years. So that was unleashed, all that. So even if the Americans and the British did do us a favor by not allowing us to bail the banks out of the problem, like happened in Ireland, where they were bailed out, and now the Irish taxpayers are saddled with enormous debts. So that was a blessing in disguise. Even if that is so, it really took us back years to have this political shock and this lack of trust and this erosion of social and moral capital that we saw in Iceland during the last 4 years. Things are now becoming normal there in Iceland. We are returning to a normal society, and hopefully we will learn from our mistakes, but it really cost us in social and moral things.
I think I'll take the last question over here.
You mentioned that the incorrect pricing of risk and overvalued assets. Isn't that I agree with you, but isn't that the heart of the modern free market economy with efficient markets and rational expectations? It shouldn't. It's a contradiction in terms with that. You shouldn't be able to overprice risk or underprice risk.
So your question is whether the markets are so rational as they're supposed to be?
Yeah.
Well, I'm a political theorist, not an economist, even if I did my doctoral dissertation on Hayek. So I had to read a lot of Austrian economics and also Chicago economics. And one thing that Frank Knight pointed out that we should really bear in mind, in my opinion, is that we have to make a distinction between uncertainty and risk. And I think we thought in the happy days before the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 that we had developed financial techniques to price risk. We did not, and we did not account for uncertainty. And I think that I would be interested in hearing Urban's observations on this, but I think that we are still subject to uncertainties, and I think that still we have to develop theories of business cycles, that we will have bubbles and we will have all of this, even if we may be able to reduce the risk of it, and we have to seek for new methods of doing so, but never forget that even if we manage to price risk, we are going to be left with uncertainty.
Urban.
Suppose you are taking your partner to a restaurant on Saturday night evening. The problem is that there are 2 restaurants where you're heading. Similar restaurants, same menu, same interior decoration, same space, same furniture, everything is alike, except one thing. In the second restaurants, there are lots of people, and the first one is empty. Which one do you choose? Even if you're rational, even if you can price risk correctly, you stand in the line. They must know something that I don't know. And that means that as long as, and that will go on forever, financial market from time to time engage in our behavior. It doesn't matter whether the textbook is clear on how to price risk. We don't care about that. They must know something that I don't know. And that's precisely the danger with financial markets and the financial system. That does not happen with tomatoes or cars or any other commodity or product you buy. But it happens in the financial sector.
So what to do about it then?
We have to protect ourselves from that. And setting up macroprudential is a way. But I don't think we could protect us totally from that. The new, as Marian said, the new financial crisis will be there sometimes in the future. The only question is when.
Looking back, it seems as though those financial bubbles and crises are coming more often now than they did a generation ago.
Of course.
I mean, we had in Sweden, we had the financial crisis in the beginning of the 90s. We had the dot-com crisis 10 years later, and then we had a new crisis. Should we have a crisis every 10 years?
And there's a very good explanation from that. Capital markets were totally regulated after the 1930s, especially after the World War II, up until the mid-80s, or give or take a decade. So that's the option. Regulate them totally. But that has a drawback, of course, because then capital has very difficult to be channeled to the most profitable investment in our respective economies. So there's a backside there too. Maybe there's a middle way somewhere.
But we have to find that out first.
We have to find that out. And we've been trying, looking at history, we've been trying for a couple of 100 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, time is running out. I would just like to ask you, Hannes, what is the most important lesson learned from the Icelandic crisis and what happened to your country?
Well, I think that it is that we have to turn from one of the deadly sins, pride, to the virtue of humility. And we have to do what my old mentor, Milton Friedman, said to me once. He said that the core of the liberal philosophy is the awareness that you may be wrong. And we have to learn from our mistakes, and we have to create more diversity. The best way of reducing risk in the financial sector is to have diverse companies which are not too big, but it should not be imposed upon the financial sector, because in capital transactions you should be able to find out what is in the long term the most advantageous composition of capital and of institutions and of banks. But I think that something along those lines are what we have to do.
And Urban, would you like to complete?
What did Rumsfeld say? The question is not what you know you don't know. The question is what you don't know that you don't know.
Right.
And that doesn't make it easier. I say thank you very much, Professor Gissurarson. Thank you very much, Urban Bäckström. We can give them a big hand.
Thank you.
Well, it was very nice.